acknowledge grief. I want to acknowledge and honor all of those before we dive in. And I wanted to read this poem as another way of stepping off into this subject. I discovered this poem from a book by Francis Weller called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And it's by a 12th century poet, Judith Halevi, I think is the name, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And it says, "These we remember. 'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch. To love, to hope, to dream, and oh, to lose. A thing for fools this love, but a holy thing. To love what death can touch. For your life is lived in me, your laugh once lifted me, your word was a gift to me. 'Tis a human thing to love, a holy thing to love what death can touch." And it kind of brings us into that arena that love and grief go together. And while the poem speaks of human grief, I also want to acknowledge the other forms of grief that we navigate with and around in our lives that are ancestral, as I say, that are other than human, that we can experience and feel. As one of my native teachers told me one time when I was expressing some deep feelings I was having, and he asked me the question, "Is that yours?" And at that time in my life, I never knew that one could ask such a question. But now I deeply understand what that means. So to feel and be aware of grief is simply to be aware and to have relationship with another. A grief ritual in and of itself is a community's way. It can be a private grief ritual, but in this context, we're talking about community grief ritual. Is a way of acknowledging the love, the connection, and also in an indigenous way of feeding the spirits. Martine Prechtel talks about this edge between grief and praise, and how really that line disappears, in which the grief and praise become the same thing in our expression. And I think that's a beautiful way to begin to hold grief and understand it in that way. I like to say when I work with people around grief, I like to say grief is not a personal dilemma, as it's often become in modern society. Grief is a collective responsibility. And it's a whole different paradigm of looking at grief as, grief is a response, it's an offering. It's a sacred offering to be made when there's loss, to be made when we feel deeply blessed, to be made when we become channels for others' grief, as we often do, and other, not just human other, but other than human others. And maybe we've had that experience of walking onto land or being in a place and being overcome with grief. Around those ways of thinking, I've heard people talk about like the trees are sad, or the mountain is sad. And the way that I think about it is that nature, the earth, the land, being our mother, begins to take on the grief that we don't acknowledge and holds it. And so when we step into these places where there are heavy reservoirs or residues of grief that have settled into the land, those sensitive to that all of a sudden can feel it. And therefore can become channels of that and healing of that. So grief is a much bigger category than one of one's personal biography or story. My experience of this particular grief ritual came when I was in Africa with melanoma, and he had gotten a call that someone, I believe it was an uncle of his had died, and we got invitation to come to a grief ritual. Grief rituals in many indigenous contexts last several days. Even in my own ancestry in the Irish, you would bring the body home, as many of you know, and it would be in the home for 3 days. And so this number 3 is an interesting thing because it's across many different traditions, this way of being with the loved one in physical form for 3 days. And so we came to this grief ritual, and there were very strict protocols of how to enter the ritual space. I think it was probably day 3 when we got notice, when we showed up. And we lined up with the eldest man first to the youngest man, the eldest woman to the youngest woman, and we walked in a procession onto the ritual grounds, as I would call them, and walking by a grief shrine. And we all carried coins. We're told to bring a coin that could be deposited at the grief shrine. Now, the grief shrine at that time had an empty chair in it because it was 114 degrees outside. The day before, the body of the loved one sat in the chair and typically would sit in the chair until the grief ritual was complete after the 3 days. And then we mingled in with the others. And there were people that were stationed at the grief shrine and members of the family that wore, I noticed, wore certain beads, and each one had what I would call a soul watcher that just shadowed them everywhere they went. And there was drumming, there was singing, there was eating, and just community of 100 people or more there. And periodically one would go to the grief shrine and really express quite cathartically whatever was stirring in them. And then again, they would go up there with the one that would be shadowing them, and then the people up there would make sure they didn't step across this ash line for danger of them going into that other world, and yet being able to cathartically release their grief. And so this would go on, for 3 days, this type of gathering. And I was deeply moved by the experience. The what Melodoma taught us in the apprenticeship with him was a version of that that we have done in working with him, and I've done other places, and got his blessing to carry this work out in the way that we're carrying it out. And it has very similar choreography and protocols of choreography and building the ritual space. And you have an ancestor shrine, you have a grieving area, and there's a particular song and drumming. And it typically begins on a Thursday night, the encampment, and then goes all the way to Sunday, with the primary grief ritual being like Saturday night. And so there's a gathering of our own stories of grief, and the building up to that ritual time, and the building of the ritual space on Saturday, and the going into the ritual Saturday night. And then, as those of you who are familiar with ritual, it's sometimes, I quit saying how long they'll last. I used to do that. And I'll say, probably no more than 3 or 4 hours. And then I can see some of you smiling that were there because it lasted at least twice all night. And the sun would be coming up, it gets the time does funny things. But in the choreography of the experience, there's the song, the drumming, and the singing. And as one feels moved by the song, they simply just tap another beside of them. And that person will usher the person that tapped them to the ancestor shrine, to the grieving area, and then back into the community. And you can have 4 or 5 people at the ancestor shrine or at the grieving area at one time. And so this circular choreography moves the ritual. and it just continues to move until it's complete. And that's the unknown part, is how long that time period lasts. So that's a kind of a framework for the grief ritual itself. I wanted to talk a little bit more about grief, but let me pause there. So I know some of you have been in this experience, given the faces that I see out there. And maybe, if there's a word of two that you want to name briefly about your experience, as someone who's been in it. I'm putting a few of you on the spot, I know.
Max, go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was part of the grief ritual 2 times, and on the first occasion, it was just about 1.5 years after my husband had died, and up until that time, there was something very isolating about and lonely about the grief that I'd experienced, and my strongest memory is having made the route to the ancestral shrine and then to the grief area, and then coming back into the community and just being held by the community. And I can still feel it now, just that sense of belonging when grief is expressed in that kind of way with everybody, rather than that sense of isolation, that it's something for you to carry alone. I'd never thought of grief as being a common experience in that way. And it's interesting because the people that I met there, I couldn't tell you what they did as a job, I couldn't tell you what they did the rest of the time, but to meet people at that deep level is extraordinary. Yeah.
Yeah, grief has a way that Mags is talking about, has a way where those definitions of the other just vanish. Those boundaries of differentiation between us and another disappear into this common ground of connection and belonging. It's a grief is a language beyond words that everyone understands. Anyone else?
I could share something. Yeah, I can really identify with that. Like that it was a very safe space. I did the ritual this summer in Cumbria. It was July. And it was kind of funny circumstances that led me to it. It was just by accident, really, that I did it. And there was nothing in my life at that moment that I was like actively grieving. So just taking part of it was quite mysterious. But I felt very, very safe, and it was a very profound experience. And I think what's happened is just actually everything that's happened after that. My life has been changing in many ways, and I think it's kind of thanks to the experience, but also the tools that were kind of offered, and perhaps that kind of courage that it takes to take part in a ritual like that and do something like that together with people that we've never met before, and being so vulnerable, and also having that holding. It's a very safe container, and the nature's working, yeah, the elements and everything, all the ancestors are kind of working their magic. And so yeah, after that I've had quite a lot of challenges in life, but I kind of learned that that's kind of where you need to go. So yeah, I'm welcoming all the kind of crazy challenges and worries and transformation that comes through kind of diving down deeper. And yeah, so it really kickstarted something for me, but I think it was the courage that it gave to face difficult situations and painful emotions. And they came after the ritual. They didn't come in the actual rituals. Yeah. Thank you.
That's thank you for that. That reminds me of that point where people look to identify with some personal story of grief, particularly the loss of another human. That seems to be the primary story that as humans we can identify grief with. But this idea that not knowing that we had grief, and the way that grief can settle into our lives in very unnoticeable ways. And it's not, and so it can be our personal grief. I mean, there's all the personal reasons for grief around loss, around betrayals, the loss of hope or expectations that didn't get met. And then there are some other areas that we don't normally think of. And those are like the parts of ourselves that have never felt seen or acknowledged. And when that happens, the doorway to accessing that or having that be seen is a grief. It's like grief opens the door when we really feel seen in a certain way. And yet those are places we don't even sometimes know exist until it happens. Places of ancestral grief that aren't part of our from birth biography, but existed before us, that we carry in our blood lineage. And that grief can actually be tapped into and all of a sudden be moving through with its own rich source of images and depth of feeling that might not make sense to one in the moment. It's like, where's this grief coming from? It's not even all mine. And as I said earlier, then there's grief of, what's happening with the planet and what gets deposited in the land and tapping into these places of grief. And so grief is that, it's a place of offering. So to come to a grief ritual, say, well, I don't really have any grief. To remember that ritual is not about the individual. Ritual is always about the collective. And the collective beyond who's simply present at the ritual. So if I was not to be feeling grief, but chose to go to a grief ritual, I should go to put myself out there to help move grief. You'll find you just open yourself up and you become a vessel for allowing it to move through you. And it might surprise you where it moves from. But the ritual itself is what helps move it. And so it's not always that we have to have a personal story of loss or grief that we can identify with. There'll be plenty of grief that has been unacknowledged and unexpressed in our own ancestral line, or and things that just come into the field during the ritual that needs to be moved. There's a collective understanding in indigenous life that when there's loss, that those that have been lost cross this river in order to get to the realm of the ancestors. And it's our grief that provides the river for them to cross. And if we don't provide this river of tears to enable those to cross over, then they might not get across. Or some of the living start getting pulled in to that river through accidents or suicides or other catastrophes where the living begin to get pulled in because of this unacknowledged grief. And so grief becomes, again, it's not simply a personal dilemma or even a collective responsibility, but an offering, a type of praise that enables us to connect more heartfully with others and always mean, when I say others, I always mean human and other than humans. And so it's through grief that our awareness expands, our ability to connect deeply in relationship to loss, and not just human loss, but the loss of all the things that are happening on the planet. And I think with all that's happening on the planet, how is it that we don't more deeply feel that? Well, one is having relationship with it. My partner had gone out in the northwest of this country and walked to the edge of this boreal forest. And I say an edge because beyond the edge, it had been clear cut. And paused there and felt this tremendous grief. We can't, without connection to our grief, we won't be aware of what's happening around us. And to have deep relationship with another, a human other, an animal other, and an other of the land. To have deep relationship means to feel deeply. But to numb ourselves with off from feeling grief, to shut it down, and it's hiding places of guilt or shame or anger. Anger is what I call petrified grief. Or that saying that I heard in Africa that an angry man is a man on the road to grief, and the sooner we can help him get there, the better for him and for us. And so when you see anger, don't be don't be impressed with its expressive. People tend to get away from it and come in close when people are tearful. They want to kind of gather in. When you see that kind of anger happening, you want to get up close to it because in there's some grief that's become petrified. And it's those that sometimes are the most angriest that need the most love and care. So all these different places that grief can reside and beginning to approach it as I call it food for the spirits. It's a way to bring offering. And not just feel this sense of turmoil, although that's a part of it, to going in deep, as I say, that dark night of the soul, where we're deep into feeling the grief of loss. It's like depression is often the result of unacknowledged and fully expressed grief. So it just kind of turns into this heavy, depressive feeling. So it's grief has a lot of different hiding places, and to come to a grief ritual is really if you're not feeling or this impulse of I have this grief I need to come and deal with, it's more like, no, I want to come because I want to come help heal. I want to help heal the ancestors that are stuck because they haven't been grieved, or as the Buddhists talk about, the hungry ghost that moves through family systems. When grief goes unacknowledged, it settles into the family systemic psyche and moves through the generations and shows up differently in obsessions, compulsions, addictions, and different ways that it can show up. Far removed from its original imprints of what caused it. So let me pause again, because I've been wanting to have a tendency I can just kind of talk on. And
I think that Jacqueline had a question.
Can't hear you, Jackie.
But it's been covered.
Yeah.
Have you
again.
unmuted me yet?
I
Sorry,
hear
I
you
thought I was
now.
being unmuted. No, I didn't have a question. I had something to offer, but you've covered it now.
Okay,
So I took my hand down again. Yeah.
thank you. Anyone else got any questions or comments?
Or an experience of grief ritual that you want to share.
I have a question, Kata. You talked a little bit about grief being held in the land. I wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
Well, a personal protocol that I go through with myself when there is a request for ritual, it's some other place in the world, is to, if I can't physically go there, to journey, to do a shamanic journey and go visit the land and connect in with the heartbeat of the land. Because the way that I interpret it is that invitations to come places often show up through a human talking to me, but what I know is that that particular human must have picked up the signal from the land itself, and so I want to find the source of the signal and connect in there and ask the question, what's needed here? What's happened here? It was one of the first grief rituals I did in the UK was in the Scottish borders, between England and Scotland, which is a land of great turmoil for many years. And so this way of connecting in deeply with the land itself to see what is being asked for in terms of ritual, in terms of grief. There are the residues of grief from other things that humans have often done to the land or to other humans. When it goes unacknowledged, it settles into the landscape. You know, that phrase, the stories are in the stones. And so to tap into these places of grief and loss that have settled into the land can be, I mean, you can deeply feel them when you open yourself up. And there's techniques of how, if you think, well, how do you feel that? How do you even become aware of that? What I call this process of focused intent and relaxed receiving or reception, where you focus your intent to a particular place in the land, and then you relax that intent back, and then you open yourself just to receive what starts to flow in, and you just start noticing. Maybe it's memories, maybe it's images. I've had those things happen. Maybe it's a depth of emotion and feeling that flows back in. And not to simply mistake these experiences, as I'm feeling this, or this triggered this in me. It's I can say this, having a background in psychotherapy and psychology, is that psychology can create kind of a narcissistic way of seeing everything as being personal projection, or a result of my experience, that I'm having this experience. It's like, no, that's not true. These things can come in out. They don't need your belief system or your projection to exist. They just need your sensitivity to be aware of them. So not to immediately misinterpret them as being something that lives in you or came simply as part of you. And so, places where there's been, various kinds of emotions are like a strong charge. And when emotions and energy happen in a place, because emotions are energy, it goes out, it goes into the place. When my experience of sitting with people that have a lot of emotion that they don't acknowledge, or maybe they're not even aware of it, and I'll feel this place in me where part of me just gets really uncomfortable, like I almost want to back up, or it feels so like there's so much emotion present. And then the moment that they tap into it and begin to feel it, I was like, I can relax. And so that anything that we or that has been repressed ancestrally, or that we have kind of shut down ourselves, what it does, it charges the energy and it sends it outward. In family systems, you see this easily if you work with families, because the children will manifest that which is not acknowledged by the others, or that which held secret somehow finds a way out through the most vulnerable place. And the same is true with non-human world, is these things that happen when they're not grieved and healed through the appropriate channels that they occurred in, then it gets energetically pushed out and it begins to and embedded into the land. And the land over time can have its way of composting and working with these things, but it's so yeah, it can settle into. Another example is the way I view animals, especially pets, domestic animals and pets, is they will often take on the energetic residues of unresolved things that those that they love carry, and sometimes to their own death. It's like where there's a friend of mine called it old ways of loving, this way of taking on things energetically. And I think because the story I tell myself is Earth as our mother is not upset and angry and grieving. It's like it doesn't have that kind of self-importance about it. But as a mother, it will take on whatever it needs to take on that we're not dealing with. And it's suffering with it now. And so when we can tap into those places in the land and move that energy through us and out, healing can happen. And in indigenous reality, another way I think about it is that the unresolved turmoil of the dead becomes the unresolved turmoil of the living. And in indigenous perspective, the way you take care of that is you turn your attention toward the realm of the other, the spirit realm, to attend to that first, so that it helps clear up things here. Otherwise, it becomes a perpetual cycle that this, where I say being, one of my teachings, being dead does not make one an ancestor, no more than being alive makes you well and conscious and happy and whole. There's this whole range of unwellness between the living and the dead, where this turmoil just circulates like this. And where grief enables those that are simply dead to transition over, and for those that are here in this world to actually heal and move forward without that heaviness. So grief being that core healing emotion that heals our generations in both directions, both behind us and ahead of us. So that was I started down that rabbit hole there, Kat, and got sidetracked into some interesting caverns. But yeah, grief in the land, and how we connect into that.
Anyone have any other questions at this point? Yeah, Elsa.
I have a question around that, the land and what you just said. I think from my experience, what's difficult is that I have a tendency to feel a lot of grief and to hold a lot of grief. And I had many massive depression since almost childhood too. So it really resonated what you're saying about the frozen grief or something like that. But I guess the answer is that I've been doing it way too much alone, and that's not the right way, because my question is about boundaries relatively to the grief of the land and the grief. There's so much grief. I mean, it's a mountain of grief we're living in. So I really hear the necessity to let it move through us, but also how can we not just drown into grief?
Yes, yes. So the container of ritual space is bigger than our personal holding or channeling of grief. Whereas on an individual basis, it is way too much. And for those like yourself that may be sensitive, it's like it never ends. And sometimes you just need a break from all this grief. So there's the ritual space of an experience like that creates or helps create the field to move that grief. And it's not just creating a field with the humans. And this is something I'll say I suspect for you personally, just in a little bit of sense about you and in your story, is this ancestral grief that goes unacknowledged. These ones can form attachments to the living, and so that they just feel this kind of perpetual unresolve. And in indigenous culture, the healing for that would be what's called ancestral line clearing work, to work with your specific ancestors, but going back far enough to what's sometimes called the bright and shiny ones, or those well in spirit.
I'm doing that right now with Daniel 4.
Perfect. That's exactly the place I would go with you. Yeah. So and to fill that out a little more, since you and I now know what we're talking about, grief like that a place of looking for that kind of grief is I would begin to get curious about the ancestral line and unresolved and attachments that have settled into your personal spirit. You may have picked up at birth, or you may simply came in with them. And these unhealed places require relationship with our ancestral helping spirits. And this is another way of approaching grief that's not the usual way of thinking in modern society. Is that we're talking about indigenous life. You call on your helping ancestors, those that are well in spirit, those that have fully made the crossing, those that are sometimes called bright and shiny. And it's often during a time when the grief rituals and the ancestralization rituals, when all of these things were in place, they had ways of tending the passage of the living to the realm of the dead, to the realm of the ancestors. And they would attend this passage to ensure that the passage happened. When these things don't happen, and then they would also do divinations into what happened. Mel Doma told me one time, he said, we were talking about death, and he said, death is not natural. And he said, in the village, death is not natural. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, what would be natural is that when you got to a certain place, you decided you were ready to go and you just laid down and left. That would be natural. He said, death by other means something, there needs to be a divination. We need to look in to see what happened. Maybe the gift that one carried never got acknowledged and got delivered, and that's why they came here. And so there's this unresolved of the gift that we're born with never got delivered, and so it kind of turned against the self. Or other ancestors that need healing can become what could be called attachments, or embedded as a hungry ghost and kind of hang on to our spirit. And we find, we could do all the therapy in the world, but often until we address the realm of the ancestors that can actually help alleviate that, it doesn't completely clear, or it simply might move to another host. So that's with you also, that's I'm glad you mentioned you were working with Daniel, because I know that's exactly what the kind of work Daniel does,
Exactly.
specifically with the ancestral line clearing. Grief rituals, and the way that I do grief rituals, do the same thing except in a ritual container. So when we create our ancestor altar, people say, well, it's okay to put ancestors that I'm not kind of sure what, I didn't necessarily like them that well. I said, well, we're going to work with all of them. And because the ritual itself is about healing us, healing them, and also getting help from that side. And it's like that old Irish proverb that says, the troubles in this world can only be healed from the other world. And the troubles over there in the other world, they can only be healed from this world. And so there's this reciprocal relationship that's implied. Or in our country, when the Lakota have the word all my relations, is sometimes referenced as all my people, or I'm in everything. It's an indication of that we're connected to everything. And so any healing work that I do will help alleviate pain in the other realm. And then those ancestors can help us here, because we're, we need assistance here from that realm. Anyway, so ancestral line clearing work, or grief rituals, or ancestralization rituals are all about healing those places and alleviating that heaviness that can settle into our spirits, especially as a result of unresolved in the ancestral realm.
Kate, Jacqueline has to go in a few minutes, and I know she's particularly interested in the event that's happening in Scotland in April. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, and Jacqueline, if you have any specifics.
Any particular question, Jackie? No?
No,
Okay.
no, nothing particular. Just in general. I guess again, maybe the time frame might be helpful.
Okay. Time frame, was it the last weekend in April?
Mm-hmm.
I'll make sure and send you the logistical information of the time frame. We'll do, I think it's the 25th. It's up there near your old stomping grounds, up near Fenhorn. And it begins on a Thursday evening. I think that's, if I'm remembering correctly,
The 25th, yeah.
And then goes to that Sunday at noon
Mm-hmm.
For the completion of it. Yeah. And the exact place should be, it's on the website and everything, but I'll make sure you get the details of the information. Yeah, thanks for joining us from, I guess you're way down under at the moment, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Way down under. Start of my Thursday morning here.
Yes.
Yeah. And it was lovely to, it's funny being in Australia and listening to this, because that experience of walking onto the land and the grief in the land happens for me quite a lot here. Yeah, because that traumatic past is quite recent in Australia. It's only 200 years old, and there's so much killing that happened of the native people that's still held in the land here.
Yeah, I was there, and when I was there in 2012, I remember thinking, it feels like what happened to the Native Americans, except much sooner.
Yeah, like much more recently.
Very recent.
Yeah.
And there's a strong likelihood I'll be down there as well this year, working out those details still about timing.
Yeah, great. Well, let me know and I'll share it around. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Kara. Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Other questions?
Max, I see you had your hand up again.
Oh,
Max? Oh, hold on, we can't hear you.
Your little microphone.
that's it. No? Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I was just remembering about something that's very current here in the north of Scotland. That up in Lewis, the island of Lewis, right at the end of the Second World War, on the 1st of January, there was a boat was taking servicemen back and to Stornoway, and just outside the harbour, they were about 5 minutes away from arriving. The boat caught onto rocks, and about 200 people out of the 250 drowned. And for 100 years, that grief has been held in the community, and it's just beginning to be expressed now.
Mm.
And I don't know very much about it, but that's really moved me to feel that grief in the land, and what an impact that must have had to the generations of both people that survived and people that died, and that feeling of expectation and suddenly everything being dashed. So that feels very current to this kind of area at the moment, as 100 years, and this grief is being released in different ways at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a powerful story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anyone else got anything they'd like to add? So, Kate, I'm aware that you have, I think, 5, is it? You've got 5 different grief rituals scheduled this year at different places in the world. I know 2 in the UK, Portugal, Australia, and at home in North Carolina.
Yes.
Which is, that's a lot of grief rituals. And I'm wondering why? Like, why is there such a call right now for these kind of rituals to be happening around the planet?
Yeah, I have asked myself that same question. And as I was saying to somebody the other day, it wasn't, well, I'm familiar with this ritual. It wasn't something I thought, oh, let's do grief rituals all over the place. The first one came as a request over in the UK. Well, not even a request for a grief ritual. It's like they had been in ceremony with me, and they said, would you come and do ritual here? And I said, well, let's check in and see what's happening. And I asked what, where the land was. And they said, well, it's in the Scottish borders. I said, well, tell me about the land. And I knew some. And then the person started sharing a story of personal loss in a pregnancy. And then I connected in with another person around the grief ritual, and they were struggling with some grief around some other issues. And I said, sounds like a grief ritual is what's being asked for. So we started it, and then from there, it became an annual event over there in Cumbria, and then began to move other places. I think my sense of the grief, both as an offering and as a element of water that creates, it's a conduit for connection and healing and belonging. It's the, in working with the ancestral elements, when we talk about water being that that element of healing, forgiveness, and reconciliation, and yet it's the human way of producing and releasing water brings that same healing, reconciliation, connection, belonging. My sense of the world is there's so much disconnection from ourselves, from the other, and even if we're just talking human, from ourselves and then from another human. But then it's evident in how we respond to the other species on the planet, to the land itself. I mean, you can't destroy something that you have relationship and love, or you wouldn't even do that. You'd protect it. And so this lack of relationship and awareness, to our environment, to our land, to each other, even to ourselves. And I think of the emotion that creates that kind of connection and depth and awareness is grief. And there's going within ritual space to go into it deep enough so that something shifts. We certainly, on a personal level, deepen our connection with ourselves, and there's a peace and an ease that follows, a clarity that follows. On a more external level, grief often takes us to the place beyond our own personal willpower, where we're, if we go deep enough, we begin to reach out to something greater than ourselves, to use that language, by what other name we might give it, be it the mountain, that we live in the shadows of, or the river that runs through our valley, or creator, or great spirit, or mystery, that we let go so completely to that which is greater than ourselves, that spring simply shows up in our lives because we let go enough, and for no other reason. And maybe it was simply waiting on us to let go enough so that spring could arrive again. So this way that release and letting go, in its own way, brings about spring and the energy of newness again. So I think we're at so many say we're at such a critical tipping point on this planet, with all of our systems, being environmental systems and ecosystems, to our social justice systems, and everything's being taxed under the weight of. And that's another rabbit hole I could get down into, the kind of the continuous growth industrial society model that says you can't just keep moving in that direction. Things just don't do that. That would be like saying it's going to be summer, and then everywhere else it's going to be summer all the time. We're not going to ever have another season. We're just always going to be in summer. And unless you live on the equator, that doesn't make sense. You live out of balance. And when we begin to live out of balance with our natural world, then we take on beliefs of scarcity, because where there is balance in relationship, there is not scarcity. And where there is not balance, we create scarcity for fear of there not being enough, or fear that I'm not enough. So it's these places that grief can get into. I say grief being that language beyond words, beyond reason, beyond differences, where myself and the other, or the other, simply disappears. And as Rumi talks about, I'll meet you in that field out beyond wrongdoing and right doing, where our souls lie down in the grass, and even the phrase "each other" doesn't make sense anymore. From that place, there's authentic relationship and connection, and we begin to feel protective toward those things we're in deep connection and relationship with. And so I think the dreaming of the planet has dreamed in this new antiviral reaction to what's happening. And very possibly the antidote will involve grief. Joanna Macy, the grandmother of eco-activism and philosophy, talks about the importance of looking looking at it in the eye, feeling it. Because if you can't feel it, then we're simply numb to it. And our ability to feel those things out there often begin with our ability to own and acknowledge and feel in here, so that it begins to expand out. Even my own work in psychotherapy over the past 30 some years, both personally and professionally, tells me that as one does that healing work, that their sense of compassion and connection begins to expand out. Once they get in here, it goes out beyond themselves to others, and not just human others, but begins to get wider. And so this way that grief can take us to that place. So I think it's, I've never thought of it as the earth dreaming in the antiviral remedy for the turmoil that we have created. And so listening to the land and the dreaming of the earth, as they might talk about in Australia, that to listen to the dreaming of the earth, it will guide us in our own healing. And then we can redream the new earth. And so it's much more global than personal dilemmas of grief inside of a therapist's office, or alone at home with our by ourselves. And these are important places to start often, but it's much bigger. And so I think grief has a huge role in making that shift, because we can't heal what we're not able to recognize and feel. We just perpetuate the dilemma, or think if we can just save the whales, or save these trees, or do that over there, that's really going to make the difference. And it's like, wait a minute, what about in here? Let's start in here and kind of make it a grassroots effort of tending that soil inside ourselves, because it is connected out there. It is connected to the dolphin. It is connected to the land. It enables me to be in deep relationship with the other in a way that I couldn't be if I don't tend to that. And again, this is both in this physical world and ancestral world of tending the other, in terms of those ancestral stories that we carry.
Thank you. I think Amanda has a question.
Me unmute.
I got you.
Oh, great, thank you. Yeah. Yes, hi, Kedar and Kat.
Hey, Amanda.
Hi. As you know, I'm so excited to learn that this work is going on in the UK. I discovered Maladoma's work quite a few years ago when I was studying to be a drama therapist. And I just felt such a deep connection to the it was actually an account of somebody going through the grief ritual with him, with the group, and I just felt such a deep connection with the experience, and really felt like it was something I would love to do. So this is to think that there's the opportunity for me to do this is really really exciting for me. And I've done grief rituals in a small way with small groups with my drama therapy work, and it's been such a moving experience in so many ways, like watching people literally move through their grief and release so much. Yeah, so I'm really interested in the Cumbria one, and I was wondering whether you could tell me more about that, about the village that's created and the ceremonial village, and what that actually means. Yeah.
So it's not just in Cumbria, but wherever we do this. So the gathering, the kind of the setting up, the gathering on Thursday evening, basically arrival, the day of arrival. Set up camp, have dinner, have an opening ceremony, we're expressing and honoring of gratitude for the place we're in. The following day, on Friday, there's what I call Death Lodge work. Death Lodge is a term, I do a lot of rites of passage work, and with vision fasting ceremonies and things like that. And whenever you're doing a ceremony of death and rebirth, you think of, we think of our lives beginning, generally we could say, you think of your life beginning at birth and ending with death, at least in this lifetime. And in these initiatory descents, as in a grief ritual or as in a rite of passage initiation, these initiatory periods of descent or a soul's descent, it runs opposite the flow of life in that you begin with death and end with birth. And so Death Lodge is a place where we begin to gather the medicine of our stories, because we're going to be making these, I haven't yet had any volunteers to go in the grief shrine and sit in the chair, but we do gather grief bundles that are a formation of our stories that we bring or that we connect with. And I do some within Death Lodge, y'all. There'll be a few pieces of individual ritual process. I say individual, but it's more like we're a group of ritual work that just shows up. Can't really say what it would be because it's very specific to the moment. And so we're in that space of healing ritual, Death Lodge work on that first day. And then there's the gathering of the grief bundles and other ceremonies on the land that go with honoring the land and specific to the place we're in. And then the next day is we begin to move more into the logistics of ritual space. The logistics of learning the grief ritual song, and there's a really short story that goes with the grief ritual song that I hold, and like right before we begin the ritual, I say it's like a 30-second story that gives meaning to the song. The song is not words; it's it doesn't have a translation. It's more of toning, not toning, but it's a sounding that to me sounds like water when it's sung. It reminds me of the element of water. And so there's the teaching of the song and I get the drummers together and we learn the rhythm, and there's building of the ritual space. We create an ancestor shrine, say off to one side, and then we create a grief shrine that's separate from the ancestor shrine. Then we have a village space that's delineated, maybe with stones or wood or separate from these shrines, and a couple of arbors that we built where there's an exit. We walk out toward the ancestor shrine and around, and then there's another arbor where there's a return back into the village. There's a fire that we create in the village that burns however long the ritual goes on. And so Friday is really the gathering of those medicine stories and other rituals and spontaneous rituals that happen that begin to build up towards the grief ritual. And then again, Saturday's daytime is more of logistics and creating the ritual space. That can be quite elaborate. Each group can be quite elaborate. Certain things I have people bring in terms of pictures and other items for the ancestor shrine, and these shrines can be, 8 feet high, 5 feet across. They're, as I say, they take on their own. Each group has its own creative flair, and then as the sun's going down on Saturday evening is when we move into the ritual, and a similar procession. We walk by the shrines and drop the grief bundles into the grieving area, shrine, and then come back into the village, and the drumming starts and the singing starts. And the song will have a way of opening your heart. And it's just at some point, whenever you feel moved, and it could be, you might be singing for 2 or 3 hours before the song comes and taps you on the shoulder, and then you reach over and tap somebody beside you. And as I say, when you tap somebody, that informs the person you tap that they're going to walk with you. You never go by yourself in ritual. You have somebody that ushers you, and they'll walk you to the ancestor shrine, and there will be an ancestor shrine keeper there at the ancestor shrine, and you spend whatever time you spend there. And all the while, the singing and the drumming still continuing. Maybe somebody else shows up with you beside you at the shrine, and they're there now until maybe 3 or 4 people are there. But you and the person that's shadowing you will walk you there, and then when you're done there, you'll walk to the grieving area. And again, you could be there with your, and there'll be the grief shrine attendants or soul watchers that are standing there to help. And it's not so much it's not a thinking thing, it just happens. And sometimes because 2 or 3 other people beside you begin, and they're wailing, and all of a sudden something moves in you, and it just begins to happen. And the soul watchers at the shrine are there to assist if people, given your background, things you've done, if people need to actually stand up and kind of lean in and be held. With the same protocols, you don't cross over the ash line into that shrine. But you can do all the expressing that you want to do. Also remind people that grief doesn't always show up in some neatly packaged tearful expression. Sometimes you go there and you're just fucking pissed off at whatever. And as I say, petrified grief can show up as anger. And so maybe somebody shows up there and they're just angry. But you stay with it, because we know we're just going to hold them and love them while they're angry, because at the other side of that anger, they're going to drop in to where the healing is. And so however form it takes, maybe it's quiet. Again, there's no way to say what it would look like for each person. But if you think the drumming, the singing, the choreography of movements happening continually, and as you come back into the village, there's a big welcome. Each person comes in. You've been to the realm of the gateway of the ancestors, and you've come back. So there's a big celebration that, where you're welcome back into the village, and again, singing, drumming still happening, and then you just join back in. Maybe you get called to go through again. I've seen people go through 2 or 3 times. And this circular choreography of movement and song and drumming and prayer and grief is the flow of it. And you do, at least I know I do, and others have been, at least you lose all sense of linear time. I say the 2 times the sun was coming up, I thought we couldn't have been out here that long, but sure enough, and the sun was coming up. And then following the grief ritual, everybody goes to bed. I said, we're gonna let the ritual space rest. I tell people, don't once we leave the ritual space, don't come back here and sit down, because it will reactivate. And so we're going to let the area and the ritual space rest, and we're going to go sleep. And then we get up and eat, and then following that, we connect around what protocols need to happen to attend to the space down there. And there's certain protocols of how to gather up all those grief bundles that we've put in that area. How do you do that, and how do you do it safely, and what do you do with it? And so there's those protocols that we go through, and like what I call leave no trace ritual, so that we put everything back and restore it to as much as possible as the way it was when we got there. Then, and meals are happening, we're eating periodically and all this. The only time, once we start the ritual, we don't break until we're complete. There's not there's not a water break, or I mean, we'll have water and you can walk off into the woods to go to the bathroom, but it doesn't, that stays going until it's complete. Then with the following day we do what's called the giveaway ceremony. And there's certain teachings about that that we'll do so that everybody actually leaves with the item they didn't come with that they received in a giveaway ceremony. Then we do a closing ritual, and hopefully have everybody on trains, planes, and automobiles by 1 o'clock on Sunday.
Sounds wonderful. And
Yeah.
can I ask about the sort of the living arrangements during that time? Are we sort of living as a community over that time?
Right. It's an encampment, so we'll be camping. Typically, there's a large camping field. We'll have an outdoor kitchen set up, and either there'll be bathrooms on site or those little porta-john things that we'll have brought in. A smaller group would be like 20 people. I'd say at least you need 20 people to actually do this ritual. 40 or 50 people would not be too many. So it doesn't really have a limit on the back end of people. And yeah, we're all camping in a big field.
Okay.
And usually if people have, I know in past when some people have had some issue with camping, the field's usually been big enough to, depending on the location, to bring something in, and like a camper or something, or they stay somewhere else. I don't always recommend that because it's hard to go in and out of a container that like that. It's hard on the person to separate themselves and then try and kind of drop back into it again. But that's
you probably miss out on quite a bit if you're not there on the spot.
Any other questions, thoughts? Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you in Cumbria.
Yes, lovely. Thank you.
Charlie. Charlie, we can't hear you. I think you are not on mute, but I can't hear you.
Yes, this one. The microphone's still off.
It was on before. Can you say something again, Charlie? Yeah, we can't hear you. Can you try? Can you type your question to me? Do you see the chat thing down below? There's a little bubble that says chat. Let me see if I can send you a message.
As a host, can you undo the mic there?
He was unmuted. We just still couldn't hear him. Want to try again, Charlie?
Not working.
No.
Yeah, nothing yet. I wish I could read your lips. Really, I've watched you sitting there, and I've enjoyed knowing that you're there in that box right below me on the screen.
If you can see the chat thing down below on the bottom of your screen, there's a little thing that says chat. And if you can find that, you could type a message.
Anyone else? While we're see if Charlie can chat as a message. But anyone else have a question or comment?
You mentioned the grief bundles as you were describing the ritual, Kata, but you didn't tell us what happened with them at the end.
that fell under the protocols of how to tidy up the space.
Mm.
So there's have to leave some surprise in there. But yeah, you don't take those home with you, and there's protocols of how to gather that up and deposit it into the land safely, which I'll leave that for the surprising part.
All right, any other comments or questions?
All right.
All
Well, it feels like we're complete.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us. I look forward to seeing some of you down the road later this year. And they're actually right before this webinar, a friend in Southern England said he wanted to put one on down there, and did I have any room left on my schedule? So there may be another one over there sometime this year. We'll see. That would be down more toward the Brighton area, I think, is where he is.
Mm.
All right. Well,
Wonderful.
gratitude to all of you, and to all of those from the other than human realm that joined us. And I look forward to seeing you all again down the road.
Mm. And I've been recording this, so I will send you all a link to the recording at some point. And if there's anyone else you know who might be interested, feel free to forward the recording to them.
Brilliant.
And all the dates and everything, all the kind of registration information is on CADA's website. So if you need any help, just let us know. We'll be able to send you all the appropriate information.
All righty.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Kata, for your work. It's yeah, such a blessing. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Charlie, email me. We should talk, since I didn't get to hear from you. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye.